Good evening, I'm Nisar Rahul. Welcome to Caveat organized by the Non-Medic Movement of Royal College. Caveat is a workshop which is focused on a main common issue the world is facing recently. It is suicide. I would like to invite Mr.Nivendra Uduman, who arrived at such kind notice to share his thoughts and facts regarding this issue of suicide. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
It's nice to hear from you. Sir, could you please give us a small intro about yourself and this matter of suicide?
Okay. So my name is Nivendra and I'm a counseling psychologist, and I'm also a trained suicide prevention gatekeeper instructor, which means I'm involved in training community members in how to identify warning signs of suicide and intervene with a friend, family member, colleague, student, anyone. So I've been working in the field of mental health for the past 7 years in Sri Lanka, and I've been involved in raising awareness on suicide prevention since the start of my career. So if we talk a little bit about suicide, suicide is, if you really look at what it is the premeditated ending of one's own life by their own hands, right? Which means most of the time people would premeditate it, which means they would plan it rather than it happening more from an impulsive or like a quick decision. If you look at the world and the context or the situation in the world at the moment, the World Health Organization has told us that over 800,000 people die by suicide every year around the world. So estimated rate is around every 40 seconds we have one person losing their life to suicide. So by the time we finish doing this session today, you will find that around the world there have been many people who have already taken their life. And suicide is the second leading cause of death for people in the age group of 15 to 30, right? The first cause is road traffic accidents. The second cause of death is suicide. If you look at Sri Lanka and its history, we have a very painful history when it comes to suicide. In the years 95-96, we were the country with the highest rate of suicide in the world. We were number one, with the rate of 47 suicides per 100,000 population, right? So that was quite a massive public health problem at that time. And then after that, there was a presidential task force set up for suicide prevention, and we saw with their interventions and other interventions that was done by the government and non-governmental organizations that the death rates reduced over the years. And now this last year, if you look at it, the rate is around 14.3 per 100,000 population. So it dropped from 47 per 100,000 to 14.3 per 100,000 population. So last year, if you look at the statistics on the police website, we know that there were about 3,074 deaths by suicide last year. Obviously, every year we find that males tend to take their life a lot more than females, so the death rates for males are higher. And last year, interestingly, we found that the highest number of suicides were in the age group of 71 and above. And starting from low as 8 years old. So that is in a nutshell the situation in the country. And of course the death rates have reduced, and I think that's a really good thing because our health systems have improved, transportation has improved, people are more aware of mental health to a certain extent, but that doesn't mean it's still not a problem. It's still not a problem because the attempt rates, people who attempt suicide keeps increasing every day, and it's still a very significant problem in our society.
Thank you. So is it possible to predict suicide from a person who is depressed and has gone through a lot in his life?
Okay. Yes, I think it's a very important question. So the important thing we need to understand that is suicide can't be always predicted, but it can be prevented. That is a message that we have to remember. It can't be predicted always, but it can be prevented. So depression and other mental illnesses like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and illnesses like that have a relationship with suicide. So especially when those illnesses are untreated or undiagnosed, then there's a risk of someone perhaps having suicidal thoughts or perhaps attempting suicide. But globally, if you look at it, most suicides we can say that are linked to depression. But that doesn't mean that everyone who attempts suicide or dies by suicide is someone who has a mental illness. There are lots of people who die by suicide without a diagnosed mental illness, right? So the answer to your question is, it can't be predicted. We can't predict it because we are all equally vulnerable. You, me, everyone attending, listening to this talk, everyone at some point in our lives, there's a risk of us sometimes thinking about suicide. So we don't have to be mentally ill to think about suicide.
And why do people attempt suicide as a way to relieve themselves from the problems they usually face in their lives?
Okay. Yeah, so a lot of people tend to see suicide as a solution. It is a way for them to end the pain and the suffering and the problems that they are having. And that is, in history, that is how suicide has been looked at. And still, people do see it as a solution. People do see it as a way of stopping all the pain that they're going through. So the problem is, because we don't really learn, even in school, how to handle problems, how to manage our emotions, how to talk about our problems. It's not encouraged. So that is one reason why people might go on to attempt suicide, because they don't really have knowledge about how to deal with their problems or their emotions. Second thing is, I think because of the stigma and shame surrounding mental health in Sri Lanka, people might find it difficult to open up about their problems. And it's not just about opening up, I think it's also because there are not a lot of people who will actually listen without judgment or without giving them advice or solutions. So that's something we see, because a lot of these things, these campaigns that we do, the talks that we do, we tell people, open up, talk, reach out. But if the other person is not willing to listen, they don't have time to listen, they are too distracted by their gadgets or their devices, especially if you talk about young people, then that is a problem, right? So the stigma is another issue. And a lot of people, when they are in that state, when they are feeling suicidal, or if they are in a suicidal crisis, it's very difficult for them to see beyond what's in front of them. So they experience what we call tunnel vision. They see only what is in front of them. They have a very short perspective on things. So which means even if there are solutions, other solutions or options that they can look at that time, they don't see it. So which is why it's really important as a community, as students, as people living in society, that we educate ourselves on how to identify someone who may be at risk of suicide, and to reach out, and for us to reach out rather than waiting for them to reach out, because a lot of people who are in that state might find it very difficult to sort of reach out and tell someone that he or she is feeling this way. So that is one of the key reasons as to why. And there are lots of other factors involved as to why someone might have thoughts about suicide or attempt suicide. We call them risk factors, right? So for example, let's say someone is experiencing isolation. Especially we are seeing this now with the pandemic, where people are stuck at home, people don't have a lot of social interactions, or they're withdrawn and isolated from society because of various reasons. Then if people have had sort of sudden changes in their lives, so let's say it's an illness, let's say it's something like unemployment or divorce or losing someone you love, so those sudden changes can sometimes put someone at risk. If they're having a mental health problem like depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, like I told you earlier, there can be a risk, right? Alcohol and other drugs, massive problem, because it does really increase the risk of someone attempting or thinking about suicide. And alcohol often is very related to people who take their life in Sri Lanka and around the world as well, right? So there are so many other risk factors which we can get into, I think, later on. But so that's my answer to your question.
Yeah, thank you. Like most people use hanging themselves or piercing themselves as methods of suicide. Is there a reason why they choose these methods?
See, normally when we talk about suicide in public settings, it's a good practice that we don't talk about methods so much, because that is not very healthy to do. But if you look at why certain methods might be popular than other methods, I think a lot of the time media and social media has a role to play. We call this copycat or contagion suicides, copycat suicides. What that means is when someone reads an article or sees something on social media, like a video or something that shows a graphic image of the method that was used by someone to attempt suicide, then most often they would sort of also be motivated to use the same method because they see it as something that worked for that person. So I think a lot of the time the media has a big role to play, and also social media, and also how we talk about suicide. So the more we joke about it, the more we sort of hear it being trivialized, being sort of spoken about in a way that is that we are not taking it seriously. A lot of the time in school, people just joke about it, saying, maruna nang hundai. So the more we say these things, the more it becomes sort of normalized as something that one should do rather than something that could be prevented. So yeah, that is why some people might favor certain methods than other methods.
If we take as a whole, we always hear men suicide more than women.
Yes.
Is there a specific reason why men attempt suicide more than women?
Yeah, there are lots of reasons for that. One reason is that men tend to be socialized or conditioned from a very small age to not be demonstrative of their feelings, not talk about their feelings, especially in our society, because it's a very because it's a very patriarchal society as well, where it's very male dominated. There are these ideas that boys shouldn't cry, young boys shouldn't cry. You would have heard it as well from your parents sometime, where they say, මොකද්ද මේ කෙල්ලෙක් වගේ අනන්නේ නැගිටින්න වැටුණා නම් නැගිටින්න ඔයාම එක මේව කරගන්න අඬන්න ඕනේ, right? ඔයා ගණන් ගන්න එපා. So these type of messages, when people, especially young boys, hear it from a very small age, they grow up believing that they shouldn't talk about what they feel, they shouldn't show what they feel. So it's a lot of bottling up that happens over the years, and sometimes that can put someone at risk of suicide. The other thing is alcohol. Around the world, it's a fact that men who use alcohol with other problems going on as well, or if they are already in a crisis situation and they are using alcohol, that puts them at great risk of suicide, because alcohol removes some of the inhibitions they might have, and it might make them more vulnerable to attempt suicide, right? So that's another thing. And the third thing is shame and stigma. So there's a stigma around men getting help for mental health problems, men and boys both, because again, the idea is that men should be strong, they should not show weakness, they should not be vulnerable, they don't need help, they have to just suck it up and carry on. So those kind of messages we have in our society as well, which prevents a lot of young boys and men from accessing support from their families, from their teachers, from counselors, from doctors, because of this idea. So that's another reason. And I think another reason why men tend to die by suicide more than women is because men tend to use more violent methods, more lethal methods, as we would call it. That doesn't mean women don't attempt suicide. They do in Sri Lanka, but the problem is sometimes, not the problem, the good thing is that they might use methods that are less lethal than men, right? So around the world, men tend to be more lethal and violent in the methods, which means the risk of them dying becomes greater by suicide.
Who is at the highest risk for suicide in Sri Lanka, like currently?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Who is at the highest risk for suicide in Sri Lanka currently, in current situation?
Who is at the highest risk?
Yeah, like the age group and the background of people.
Right. It's difficult to say really, because the statistics show us, because normally we believe young people are at risk or middle-aged people are at risk, but the statistics last year show us that older people above the age of 71 had the highest rate of deaths by suicide. So that's a problem. So I'm not going to say one age group is at risk. I'm going to say all age groups are at risk. But generally, normally we say age between 14 or 14 to 30 are at great risk, right? But middle-aged people, especially now because there's a lot of job loss, economic problems, other social problems because of the pandemic, middle-aged people and older adults also can be quite vulnerable. So it's difficult to pinpoint and say this group is exactly at risk, but I would say because of the certain conditions at the moment, all these age groups can be at risk of suicide.
Is suicide related to impulsiveness?
It sometimes is, but the problem is because people always believe that suicide is impulsive and people just do it out of the blue, that prevents us from actually recognizing the plenty of warning signs people might give before they attempt suicide. Most of the time, 8 out of 10 people would communicate in some way their ideas or their plans about wanting to take their life. But the problem is we often miss it. We don't look for it because we believe that it's only an impulsive thing. People just do it at the snap of the moment. But actually, a lot of people plan their attempts sometimes months ahead, right? So if we don't learn how to recognize the warning signs, that's a problem. So then that is why most people tend to believe that it's impulsive, because they miss the signs before that. But yes, there is definitely an impulsiveness related to it. We see that sometimes, for example, with a relationship breakdown, it could be something else like exam failure in young people. We see that happening in Sri Lanka, where the rates go up when exam results come out and things like that. In history we have seen it. So what tends to happen is, if you just think about it like stacking a pile of books together, right? So you stack one book after the other right up until you reach the limit to where you can stack. Then after you stack it to that amount, even with just one finger, if you push a little bit that stack of books, you will find that the entire book stack starts to collapse because it has reached that point of being able to not balance itself. So it's similar with us as human beings. When we it's because suicide is often a result of a lot of things coming together. There is no one reason or one thing that would we can say is the main reason for someone taking their life. It's often a collection of a lot of things, which makes it complex. It's not easy for us to understand because there's a collection through time of a lot of issues, a lot of things that have kind of piled up together, and it is the last thing, the relationship breakdown or the exam failure or the job loss or something, that pushes the person finally towards attempting. So there are these risk factors, what we call fundamental risk factors, that are these things I spoke about. Things like it could be your age, it could be illness, it could be the environment around you, it could be your family history, it could be so many things that pile up over time, and then the final trigger factor can be something that we might see as being impulsive, but it's not actually that. It's that over time it has built up. So of course there are people who for example, because of alcohol use, because of drug use, or because of their own inability to control their impulses, might attempt things like self-harm, which is a bit different than suicide attempts, right? So self-harm, or we call it non-suicidal self-harm, NSSI, right? So basically what that means, NSSI, not H, non-suicidal self-injury, not harm, right? So what that means is people might injure themselves in different ways without the intention of dying. They might just harm themselves because that's their way of coping with whatever they are going through. But sometimes that, because of impulsiveness, that can lead to accidental death, because they might impulsively harm themselves in a way that can lead to accidental death, which then becomes more like a suicide. So yeah, I think if we as a community focus on educating, starting from, I think, kindergarten, educating young children on how to manage themselves about emotionally can reduce this issue to a great extent, which unfortunately we are not doing. Because if you think about your own school, because I am from the same school, you know that for example, in life skills class, I don't know whether you guys have it, I had life skills class when I was from primary till around grade 6 or 7. I had life skills where they used to come and teach us how to make salads, how to make fruit salads, how to do sandwiches, all of these things. But we never learned how to cope with problems. We never learned how to talk about our feelings. We never learned that there's help available. So I learned that there's help available only after I left school. That is too late. That is 13 years of my life not knowing how to deal with emotions, right? So I think school has a major role to play, but unfortunately school doesn't seem to see the importance of it yet for some reason. Yeah.
My next question is, does biological factors have an effect on this so-called suicide?
Yeah, it does. It does, but it's not biology alone. It's most often biology combined with environmental issues, factors, right? Yeah, so sometimes changes in brain chemistry, certain illnesses can make someone more vulnerable, and sometimes people carry what we call a genetic load as well. So in their genes, if there's a genetic vulnerability towards suicide, because if there's a family history or if people have sort of taken their lives before that person in the family, there can be a genetic load that they carry, but that genetic load is in itself not enough. It has to be combined with a lot of other factors for someone to be at risk of suicide.
Yeah. Does alcohol and other drug abuse, like how do they have an effect on suicide?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, it definitely is one of the most closest things that have a significant impact or relationship with suicide. So a lot of the time when people die by suicide and an autopsy or a post-mortem is done, a lot of the time people find that there is alcohol in the blood before they have attempted suicide. So like I said before, what alcohol and other drugs do is that it reduces that person's ability to think rationally. It reduces inhibitions. So if you just think about it, what I'll do is I'll quickly share a slide with you. Can you make me
Yes.
co-host? I'll quickly share a slide that will just help you understand this a little better, right? Just give me a second. If you look at this, this thing is called the many pathways to suicide, right? So we talk about biological factors. You already asked me. So the fundamental risk factors are these, the biological risk factors. So we know that there can be a genetic load. We know that men have more risk of suicide or dying by suicide than women. Certain ethnicities, so we don't see this much in Sri Lanka, but in other countries, Western countries especially, we see that white males are more likely to die by suicide than perhaps people of color, right? And age we already spoke about. So what tends to happen is these fundamental risk factors that we carry, that are biological, that are psychological or personal, and that are environmental, some of these environmental factors don't really match with the Sri Lankan context, but if you look at global situation, it does matter. So for example, in the environmental sector, you can see season of the year. So sometimes when people, especially living in cold countries, when it's winter, there's more likelihood for them to develop something like depression, which can put them at risk of suicide. Certain geographical areas. So in Sri Lanka also, we know that rural areas, there are more suicides than urban areas. And model for suicide means what I talked about earlier, the contagion or the copycat suicides because of the media, right? Now, the thing is, these risk factors alone often don't put someone at great risk of suicide, but they have to have these what we call the triggers, which I talked to you about earlier. You remember the pile of books, and what you push is the trigger. So it could be a crisis in a relationship, it could be a loss of freedom, it could be getting expelled from school, it could be an illness, it could be a death of someone you love, whatever. Then because of these things, there can be an increasing sense of hopelessness and a thinking about suicide as a solution. Now, the interesting thing comes here when you talk about alcohol and drugs is that most often there is a wall of resistance before they actually go on to attempt suicide. So the wall of resistance is what protects them. There's a protective wall. But problem is, soon as you add alcohol into the equation, this wall starts to crumble. And then it's more likely that someone might attempt suicide. So there are plenty of stories where people have been thinking about suicide, and then they have gone on to, for example, drink alcohol, and that has sparked the attempt, right? So this is just a way to understand how alcohol can have a role. So if you look at this is another important thing, right? So this is called a lethal triad. So when someone, if you look at this triangle, right, the alcohol and drugs and the access to means. So access to means is nothing but if they have easy access to the methods they might use to attempt suicide, these three things is a huge problem. The risk of suicide is really high when this triangle is present. So you can see one side of the triangle is the upset person, then the person having easy access to means, and of course alcohol and drugs in the picture. So then when there's alcohol and drugs in the picture, this wall starts to crumble, and then if they have access to these means that's there on the side, which are the causes of death, it's really likely that they might attempt and actually die by suicide. So I hope that makes sense, how alcohol and drugs can play a very significant role in increasing the risk of someone attempting or taking their life.
So why do people attempt suicide to prove something or to get sympathy?
Okay, that is a wrong idea. It's a misconception. People don't attempt suicide to get sympathy, and it is not an attention-seeking behavior as well, but it's a way of seeking support. They might be trying to communicate to someone that they need help, or they need someone to stop hurting them, or they need someone to change their behavior. So it's more of a support-seeking behavior than attention-seeking behavior. So the more we talk about it as an attention-seeking or sympathy-seeking behavior, then the more stigma we contribute to. Then it becomes more difficult for people who might be experiencing suicidal thoughts to get help, because they might be ridiculed, shunned, criticized, trivialized by family, school, teachers, saying අයියෝ නිකන් ඔය අවධානය ගන්න විතරයි කරන්නේ, නැත්නම් ඔයා ගණන් ගන්න එපා, ඔයත් ප්‍රශ්නද, අපිට ඌට වඩා ප්‍රශ්න තියෙනවා. So you will, even I heard this a lot from teachers in school, right? They didn't see the importance of these issues, not just suicide but anything, right? So the more we say it's for sympathy, the more problematic it becomes. So it's not for sympathy, but people might attempt suicide because they want to communicate how they're feeling about something to someone else. So it can be a means of communication as well, but it is not sympathy seeking. Right?
That's all for now, sir. Thanks a lot for the wonderful session.
Right.
We learned a lot, and thanks for coming.
All right, no problem.
Thank you.
Okay, have a nice day.